Tensions between South Korea and Japan are starting to simmer again amid continued disputes over historical and territorial matters. This week on After 10, we examine the challenges facing both nations as they try to progress bilateral relations. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's recent right-wing positions are threatening multilateral relations in Northeast Asia. Since Abe's Liberal Democratic Party won by a landslide victory in July's election, the right-wing movement seems to have accelerated. On the back of continued provocations by Japan's right-wing government, tensions between Korea and Japan have risen. To help us navigate through the challenges, we are joined this week by Lee Myon-woo, Vice President of the Sejong Institute. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, August 15th is National Liberation Day here in Korea, but in Japan it is a day of defeat, a shameful day, if you will. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said leading up to the day that he would not visit the controversial Yasukuni War Shrine, but he did allow his cabinet members to visit. How do you view the situation?
I think we can say two things. First, that as promised, Prime Minister Abe at least showed his concerns or concerns of the other neighboring countries like Korea and Japan that it's not proper to pay a visit to the shrine. At least so it is showing of his concern or his kind of things to the neighboring countries. But on the other hand, the second, the kind of nationalistic mood of the country, Japan, was so strong that he could not or would not prevent his cabinet members from visiting to the shrine. So it's kind of showing two things.
For those who aren't familiar with the Yasukuni War Shrine and why it is so controversial, could you tell us why it is and explain what it represents?
Yasukuni Shrine is kind of a central place for national or nationalist Shintoism. And Shintoism is a kind of a native kind of religion of Japan. But the Meiji Restoration or the Meiji oligarchs made that Shintoism as a kind of national religion to kind of integrate or unifying Japan at that time. So it became more, let's say, chauvinistic in a sense and nationalistic. And one of the reasons that Yasukuni Shrine became the focal point of controversy or dispute is that it includes those war crimes of that World War II. So we also criticized this kind of a visit, but China is very strongly against, Prime Minister or his cabinet members going to the shrine.
The U.S. has also spoken out and expressed its concern about these visits. The Congressional Research Service recently released a report expressing that concern over the visits. Where does that concern come from?
First, that is that Prime Minister Abe's visit to the shrine would increase that instability or the conflicts of the Northeast Asian countries like China and Korea. These Northeast Asian countries, the kind of a central place for a growing or developing economy. So that's, I think, the second reason. And another thing is that it also mentioned about those comfort women issue. They will carefully watch what Japan or the Prime Minister Abe is doing about that.
So given that landscape, given those concerns, why do we continue to see Japanese politicians make these visits to the war shrine knowing that it is going to cause those concerns?
If we see those politicians' arguments, for those conservative politicians of Japan, they think it is kind of a national cemetery. And in a sense, Yasukuni Shrine is, as I just mentioned, is a symbol of Japanese glory days, in a sense. I mean, it's the so in a sense, it's a kind of a symbol of national pride and that kind of things. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, that, as we all know, Japan has experienced economic downturns over the last 20 years or so. And accordingly, the Japanese society has some kind of, lethargic kind of state or situations. So there are many problems, in a sense, socially. So these conservative politicians try to make their nation or their society more viable or invigorated, in a sense, by using this kind of nationalistic means, and so making, let's say, Yasukuni Shrine visit is okay, or that kind of things. That's a slogan.
We can't leave out, when talking about the tensions between Korea and Japan, the Dokdo dispute, of course. The Japanese Cabinet Office recently carried out a poll of the Japanese people. It found that 61% of the Japanese people view Dokdo as being Japan's. What do you think was the intention behind carrying that survey out in the first place?
As well known that for Japanese people for a long time, Dokdo is kind of a forgotten issue. So it was their kind of a duty or the responsibility to make the Dokdo issue known, since to their argument, it is they have their sovereignty over the islands. So, but it has been kind of, task for the government, and this time it was the kind of, continuous efforts to make the issue known. And as we know that we are practically kind of, ruling over the island, but for international dispute, Japanese, since they are arguing their sovereignty, they need to make this island as a dispute areas. So I think it's one part of that, their such efforts.
Japan has also escalated tensions by condoning the use of the rising sun flag. Before we get into the implications, let's talk about what the rising sun flag is and what it represents.
I think it is pretty much clear that if you see the flag, but the flag has a sun in the center, which is radiating all over the kind of world, so to the world. So there are there are 16 kind of rays, and some has 8 rays. So which means that Japan, the sun kind of symbolizes Japan, is going, all around the world. So that is why people argue that, or criticize that, it's the symbol of the Japanese imperialism and militarism. So that is why, in a sense, it was kind of prohibited to use it after the war. And about 1954, or they kind of, we used it as the naval self-defense forces tried to use it again.
One of the things, as you mentioned, that Japan wants to do is possibly reform its pacifist constitution. How do you view that process?
I think the chance to revise the constitution has been much greater than the past. There has been several attempts by those conservative politicians, but since there are protesting kind of forces who think that those peace constitution is very good, and very much some things, doing good things about Japan, post-war Japan. So they kind of protest against those revising efforts. But as I just mentioned, I mean, the situations, especially that international situation has been changing. So as we can see in those public survey, I mean, there are kind of growing percentage of the people kind of agreeing with revising or the responding to the changing international situation. So I think the priority is great, but I think it won't happen. It won't happen instantly. That is why, in a sense, even Prime Minister Abe mentioning about those 96 clause first, that the ninth clause, the so-called peace clause, but the 96th clause, which is talking about those, we need to have 2/3 of the people in the
Approval.
Diet approval.
Right.
But he tried to change that to the 1/2 of the approval. So that is why I think it will take time.
Some look at the situation and say, why shouldn't Japan be allowed to reform its constitution if it wants? But there's a historical reason for the reason why they have a pacifist constitution. Can you explain that for us?
Of course, there are, in the UN Charter, there is an enemy state clause. But the main reason that Japan kind of has kept this peace clause or peace constitution is that, as just mentioned, that there are some forces or groups that who are agreeing that this peace constitution has some role for keeping Japan as it is now. So I think that is the main reason.
What is your biggest concern as it pertains to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's right-wing stance?
I just mentioned, I mean, probably one of the worst scenario would be this, a military kind of competition getting worse and worse. But another thing could be that it will leave out the other alternatives. There is, as I just mentioned, right now, Asia or the Northeast Asian countries facing the good chance of developing economically and socially and all that kind of things. But by putting so much resources to those military things, then those economic or social development or social welfare development could be hampered in a sense. So that's the second thing that I'm worried about in a sense. And the third thing is that one of the big problem right now these Northeast Asian countries facing is that kind of lack of confidence. I mean, so in a sense, that's why there are so much conflicts over those Senkaku Island or Dokdo Islands. And for confidence building, we need to practice in a sense. I mean, we need to try to do that kind of, things. But with those, let's say, military competition going on, I mean, that chance of making those confidence building will be lessened, so reduced. So that's the third, another thing that I'm worried about.
Some say they believe that Japan, with this right-wing stance, is leading down a path of isolation. Would you agree with that?
Probably in the region, I think they are already isolated in a sense. So that is why Prime Minister Abe at first visited the United States, so making or re-strengthening that U.S.-Japan alliance and that kind of things. And after that, he went to Europe or Russia, and recently he went to that Near East and some other Southeast Asian countries. So, in a sense, he's trying to get rid of this kind of isolation. So it is not only Korea and China, but there are some other countries so they can develop their relations and their, let's say, national capabilities. So it is a little doubtful that they will be isolated in the world sense.
Abrogating the Kono statement has also been talked about, something that has also raised concerns and tensions in the region. Before we get into the implications of that, could you please explain to us a little bit about what the Kono statement is exactly?
Simply put, Kono statement was the first, let's say, Japanese government's document stating that there has been, let's say, force operating for making those comfort women houses and mobilizing comfort women. And so in a sense, that's very meaningful in a sense. Since right before that, they kind of denied that there is any use of force for mobilizing for making the kind of comfort woman houses in the near that military bases and that kind of things. So there was good start, but as we all know that after that, after let's say Arirang statement, there are many statements kind of denying that kind of statement. They say there are no exact kind of evidence that saying that there was the use of forces and that kind of things.
The issue of the comfort women is now being somewhat recognized more in the international community. The U.S. In California put up a comfort woman statue recently, much to Japan's chagrin. What is your take on that situation?
I think comfort woman issue is the kind of human right kind of issue. So that is why, in a sense, United States or the Congress also very strongly, going against that Prime Minister Abe's or Abe cabinet's kind of doing anything other than the Kono statement, that kind of thing. So I think it should be kept, and comfort woman issue is not only driven by the Koreans, but it is, it's all over the kind of world. For Dutch has also kind of evidences, and so in a sense, for Koreans, in a sense, it is very certain thing that there has been comfort woman, not only comfort woman, but there are use of force to have that kind of places and that kind of things. So I think we should keep that that kind of efforts to collecting data and that kind of things.
We're talking about the past wrongdoings here. What is the best way then for Japan to make a formal apology and then compensate victims from the past?
As I just mentioned, I think Kono statement or the Arirang statement could be regarded as okay, good start. And there was done something about 10 years or some years ago. But as I just mentioned, the Prime Minister Abe's efforts to do something other than that is kind of turning the clock back to the 10 years or some years ago. So I think it is better to start from that Kono statement and Arirang statement. And but what we have seen was that even with those Kono statement and Arirang statement, there are many other kind of wrongdoings after that. I mean, so that is why, in a sense, Koreans or Chinese does not believe that they are really had apologized about those wrongdoings and that kind of thing. So I think for Japanese, they should not go back to that or negate what they have said in that statement and that kind of thing. So it is not that Korean arguing that they should apologize again and again, but since that cornerstone of moral estimate, it would be okay. So they should not do something that deny that kind of statements. But what I have seen was that there are many so-called dismal remarks that negating or denying those corner statements and moral statements. And Abe's doing is, in a sense, that another effort to kind of denying or negating that kind of statement. So there is a problem.
And how would you assess President Park Geun-hye's handling of Japan so far?
So I think it's quite understandable that she mentioned about that he should have the proper or right, historical kind of consciousness about that, knowledge about history. But as I mentioned, that even though we admit and we understand that the reason why she mentioned that kind of things, but we also kind of for our goodness or for Korea's national interest, we need to separate and to delete that security issues from those historical kind of issues. So I think to make them more liberal in a sense, I think we should meet and talk about them, so making some differences less. So in that sense, we need more effort too.
What is the best way to build trust between the two countries then?
So, first of all, I think, and most of all, we should meet in a sense. Those two presidents should be in the same place and talk about the differences and make those narrow the gaps in the things. So, in a sense, that's the most important thing, I think.
Certainly complicated matters taking place between Korea and Japan. We do appreciate you coming on the show and providing your insights. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.